On today's episode, we're going to be continuing our ongoing series called Surfacing Secrets, Explore the Ocean, Know the Planet. I'm very delighted to have this conversation today with members of Oceans Networks Canada, as well as some Indigenous people that are representing and working with Ocean Networks Canada to explore and build trust with Indigenous communities in and around Canada and expand the ability to gather data for the network and for the Indigenous communities, and really benefiting both relationships and both sides, which I think is really important. We're going to be discussing all that on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin, and this is the podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. And today we're going to be talking with Ocean Networks Canada in our ongoing series, Surfacing Secrets, Explore the Ocean, Know the Planet. And we're going to be having a very important conversation. It's about relationship building when it comes to ocean science, especially with Indigenous communities. There's a reason why ONC has these conversations. It's because the ocean holds stories as old as time, but unlocking them takes more than just instruments and data that ONC provides. It takes trust, it takes respect, and the joining of knowledge systems that have guided people for millennia. Ocean Networks Canada set out to connect technology with tradition, science with stewardship. The journey began with listening, not just to the ocean, but to the voices of Indigenous communities across Canada. Communities that have been ocean guardians long before ocean monitoring had a name. ONC learned that real partnership doesn't arrive with a PowerPoint, it begins with a conversation. It's built over shared goals, co-created projects, and the recognition that knowledge flows both ways. From whale and shipping monitoring to pollution tracking in Burn Inlet, the work is driven by local priorities. These are not one-off consultations, they are long-term community-led commitments. Indigenous knowledge brings the boots on the ground or in the water perspective that enriches scientific data. Western science brings the tools that can extend the reach of these observations. Together, they reveal a fuller picture of ocean change and how it affects people and ecosystems. In this episode, we meet three people shaping these relationships from the inside. Maya, Peter, and Ken share how ONC and Indigenous partners are reshaping ocean science in Canada. This is a story about more than data. It's about connection, respect, and shared responsibility to protect our ocean for future generations. Now here is the interview with ONC about Indigenous relationships and building knowledge. Enjoy, and I'll talk to you after the interview. Hey Maya, hey Peter, hey Ken, welcome to the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Are you ready to talk about Ocean Networks Canada and Indigenous relationships, looking to find more data from the ocean?
I'm ready.
Nice. I'm excited. This is going to be a lot of fun. We're here to talk about something that is extremely important, not only in Canada, but around the world, and that is building relationships with local communities. So Maya, we'll start with you. Why don't you let us know who you are and what you do?
All right. Hi, I'm Maya Huberex. I'm a first-generation Canadian of Dutch Indonesian heritage, and my role is with Ocean Networks Canada as the Associate Director of Learning and Community Engagement. So I lead a team that works with communities all around Canada, especially with Indigenous communities, to get ocean data into their hands and to see what we can do to help them advance their priorities for ocean science in their regions.
I love it. That's wonderful. Peter, how about yourself? Why don't you let us know who you are and what you do?
Yeah, I'm Peter Romer. So Peter's my Frisian side, and Asamgan is my Niska side. So I'm from the Niska Nation of people of the Nass River. And I'm the Indigenous Community Liaison for Ocean Networks Canada, which means everything Indigenous comes through my desk eventually, and I get to connect all the amazing experts in our network with those nations. And really, I have the cool job of asking nations of how can I support you and in what capacity in various levels of things. And it's great to go into communities and work with communities and see if we can get some monitoring devices in the water.
Love it. And Ken, how about yourself?
Nidali Sakali Kapwood Muin. My name is Ken Paul. I'm a member of the Wolastoqey Nation. My home community is located in Nagutguk, or otherwise known as Tobic First Nation in northern New Brunswick, in the Atlantic coast. I work independently on a number of different contracts, but all of the work that I do, I'm either supporting First Nation rights, specifically within fisheries. I work with a lot of scientists, a lot of academics. I work with industry groups and with a number of First Nations. And basically, what I'm trying to do is help to empower Indigenous communities. I'm working on with a lot of partners as well. And although I'm very, very busy, because there's a lot of work to be done in this area, I also try to make sure that the community members that I work with also have an opportunity to work in this field.
Love it. I think that's wonderful. That's perfect. Let's start with how the program was built. So Maya, can you share ONC's Indigenous engagement team, how that came to be, and why it's been like such a core part of the organization?
Sure, yeah. So ONC started formally engaging with Indigenous communities in 2013 and 2014. We received funding to install monitoring equipment at locations that might potentially see resource-related development in the coming years in BC, so specifically related to sites that were of interest for liquefied natural gas. So this was quite a controversial project to be attached to, but an important component of the funding we received was to engage with the Indigenous communities who would potentially be nearby these installations. So that was the beginning, and within ONC, I was already working with the learning and engagement team, and we were doing a lot of work around trying to make ocean science inclusive. And so it was a natural fit for me to start working on this challenging project of engaging these communities. So, now I'll do a super fast forward to how we do things now, just to build up a contrast. I would never go into a community with funding in hand and say, we have this project, what do you think of it? That is not the way to do things. But at the time, this was how it all started. And so part of the funding we received was to hire 2 positions, one of which is the position that Peter now has, the Indigenous Community Liaison. And the other role that we created was the Indigenous Community Learning Coordinator. So that was really the beginning of having ONC having specific positions for Indigenous people, because we wanted to advance our partnerships with Indigenous communities. And so over the years, we certainly learned a lot, and I personally have learned so much from working with the communities and the staff members in these roles. So it's been a journey for ONC.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, what a huge program to build up, stuff we haven't seen before, and so I think that's amazing. Now, Peter, you've worked directly with a variety of different nations. What have Indigenous nations? What have you learned about building trust and sustaining partnerships specifically in ocean science, like through ONC?
Well, let's start from the beginning a little bit. Is that Indigenous have been on the front lines of ocean observation since millennia. Here on the coast, just in BC alone, on Triquet Island, there was an archaeological study between UVic and Hakai, and they found 13,500-year-old footprints of sea lion hunters. So we've been observing for thousands of years on our coastlines. Around the world, there's 2,000 Indigenous communities just on the coast, representing over 27 million people. But they're the least engaged, and so. Really, back in 2019, for me, the passion started at Ocean Obs 19 when we brought 53 53 Indigenous delegation of Pacific people from all around the Pacific, as far as Saipan and Canada, together to speak on proper, meaningful Indigenous engagement and building true partnerships and what that meant. And 6 years ago, really, that people were still new to Indigenous engagement, and which is really surprising, since how late we are in the game when it comes to education around Indigenous communities. And what kind of sparked my passion around that to advocate for Indigenous was that I was asked to speak to a group of people. We were holding a town hall and we had a bunch of presenters, we had a bunch of sessions, but I was asked to speak to Indigenous engagement at a reception of a group of scientists, and someone said, "Hey Peter, I overheard what you were saying, can you come and speak to my group?" And so I went to speak to that group with my Inuit friend, and that group of scientists didn't want to have anything to do with me. They turned their backs cold to me. It was extremely rude. I thought, oh, that's funny, so I tried again. Then they all turned their backs to me, and their friend was like, hey guys, I'm trying to get you to listen to Peter. But I was about to have some choice words, but just kind of backed off, and I just realized that there was a lot of work to do in the ocean science community, and that there are older boys and girls clubs out there that still exist that they think they can not engage with Indigenous on the coastlines. And so this gave me a passion to advocate for Indigenous, not just in Canada, but worldwide.
Now, doing it as part of ONC and being able to build these relationships, bring it from your point of view, taking your experiences and, coming in a more positive way and being able to connect with other nations as with this trust, because they trust you because of your experiences and your knowledge that you've had. Do you find it more rewarding being able to talk to people of different nations within sort of the context of Canadian ocean science?
Oh yeah, it's always rewarding, but that trust, I've been working with Indigenous communities for over 25 years. I'm an Indigenous filmmaker and had an Indigenous show for around 14 years on CTV. So I built a lot of trust with these communities, and really, which takes a lot of just listening and understanding. So when I got the job at ONC, I already had relationships with these communities and a fairly good connections with different chiefs and different leaders around, and a pulse on just some of the struggles that our people face on the coast. I grew up as a commercial fisherman since I was 6 months old till I was 19. I lived on the boat full time and been through all these different fishing communities, so I understood the type of work they were doing in their communities already. So working with those nations, I was able to gain their trust, in various capacities. It really depends on what a nation is looking for, whether it's in education, is it in ocean monitoring, is it further in science, and it's really just communities often approach us or get certain funding, and then we find a way to work together, which is usually, hopefully, from the budget up in a true partnership sense.
Right. Amazing. Awesome. Now, Ken, you had experiences working with Parks Canada, with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans in Canada, and National Fisheries Leadership. So how does that shape your approach to working with ONC and Indigenous communities?
Yeah, so I had a federal career for 20 years before I started working with First Nations chiefs. I first started as a hydrographer with the Canadian Hydrographic Service. I did ocean mapping for 10 years. I had worked with Parks Canada for 10 years, including a stint up in the Northwest Territories in the high Arctic, working under comprehensive land claims. And really what that had done for me, not only exposed me to Indigenous peoples across Canada, but it let me understand what the federal system is really all about. I know that people in our communities, when they look at federal governments, they just see it as government in general. They don't understand the divisions within the government, the responsibilities, and they really, we're trying to figure out how to develop the relationship with Canada from our community perspective. After I left the federal government back in 2012, I started working directly for First Nations chiefs, both regionally in Atlantic Canada as a fisheries director, but then nationally with the Assembly First Nations as the national fisheries director. And so when I'm on the other side of the ledger here, trying to advocate, I try to find ways that we can actually develop these partnerships, knowing some of the constraints that the federal partners are with. And through that exposure with the Assembly First Nations, this is where I met Maya and Peter, and I started working also with non-government organizations. And I really find that the NGOs in general are really sincere about working through these things, but again, they sort of face the same challenge of how do you make this work with, under a federal system. So I would say that the exposure and the training and the networks that I had developed has really helped me, and it's helped shape like where I am doing my work today.
Love it. Awesome. Now, I'll start this question with you, but I'll start this with Peter, and I'm going to extend it to Maya too, because I think it's really interesting. When we talk about bridging these knowledge systems, Indigenous and say like Western science. So Peter, like how does like this program, this is from ONC, blend Western science with Indigenous knowledge systems in a way that respects and values both and benefits everybody, but also uses both of them to accomplish the goals for both?
Well, we really try to have a lot of our projects community-led, so it's really up to the nation to drive the bus. We're just there to really help with the tech and get those sensors in the water, and they really let us know. But a healthy, project usually starts from that budget up, so we're all on the same page together. We never really want to be ever in a scenario where we're dictating down due to like how the funding apparatus may work. So we really, really believe in community-led projects, and Indigenous engagement is not parachuting in. It takes a long time to create that relationship, and we never expect that nations are ready to jump or whatever, because we kind of, it's a project by project basis. So it's often. I wish we can get sensors in the water for every nation, and we could just pay for it for them. Mm-hmm. But it's a slow process depending where that funding is coming from. But really, the important thing to us is community led, and that really obviously starts on the good foot and the right way to do it. In the past, there's been lots of parachuting in with a PowerPoint and saying, mm-hmm. hey, this is the project, and then leaving and calling that consultation, which is not. Unfortunately, other parts of the world, that's still happening, even in the U.S. And we consult a lot with our nations, with these different delegations that we're part of. We really hear out everybody from coast to coast, and it's really about building a relationship first before we start talking business.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was mentioned, Maya, that sometimes the communities are the ones who are approaching ONC because they would like to be part of this type of program, or maybe have a specific need and maybe have some funding. But sometimes there might be some funding available that ONC has, and you're building these relationships. What have you learned works the best in terms of working, like from your perspective and from the program's perspective, of working with a lot of these Indigenous communities? Is it them coming to you, or is it like maybe a specific funding's available, and then through relationship building that Peter and Ken have done, as well as the ONC program have done, we work together and saying, hey, we could, remember we talked about this, and we'd be able to get some of these instrumentations in. What's the best way, or what has been the most productive way in the past that you've had the experience with?
I think what Peter said about trust is really key to all of this. So the best way to work in partnership is to have a respectful relationship with trust established with between all partners, whether those are Indigenous communities or other scientific partners, whoever they are. And I think what's very different to the scientific working culture is that there needs to be a recognition that the time and the money to build those relationships needs to be invested before a project even starts or is proposed. So I think what is very unique about how we've been able to approach this is because we've invested in people and we've grown now our Indigenous engagement staff and also grown capacity in our organization among all our teams in having this mindset towards working that relationships are critically important. So because of that investment in people and time to do that work, Ocean Networks Canada is able to reach out to communities and travel to communities without necessarily having a specific project on the table, just with the objective of, let's see if we have something of interest that we might want to work on together, and let's hear from this community what their priorities are and if maybe there's a need that Ocean Networks Canada can fill. And I think once you figure that out, so if we hear from a community that there's something that's really of interest to them and they know about what Ocean Networks Canada can do, and they also have heard often through word of mouth about the work that we've done with other communities, then we might be in a place to start talking about, hey, let's submit a proposal together, or let's see if this funding could work, or maybe you could join this other project, or maybe we could introduce you to this scientist at a university who's doing something similar. So I think, what's been a real, I do think it's changed quite a lot since the beginning, but it is a culture change in science to recognize that that's a very important part of the work. It's not, a sideline to the work or a delay to the work. It's part of the work that needs to happen in order to do this in a good way.
Love it. Now, Ken, are there examples of, like, in a situation where Indigenous knowledge provided critical insight in that technology or Western science couldn't, like in your experience?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to talk about specific examples, but I can talk about different areas where it actually works, and it has started with the partnerships. It has started with relationships. And like Maya and Peter are emphasizing this because it is critically important, because there's been a history of people coming into Indigenous communities, grabbing information, grabbing knowledge from them, and exploiting that knowledge. And in some cases, that information has been used against the communities. So this trust, this value of trust, is really important. I've had one chief mention to me last year that when people come into his territory, they're coming in there to take something away. Areas where it seems to be changing are places like in Cape Breton, which is part of Mi'kmaq, where they have developed the CEPI partnership, which is the Collaborative Environmental Partnership Initiatives, where they, under the leadership of actually Charlie Dennis, who is a Mi'kmaq from Eskasoni, who has since passed into the spirit world, had brought people together and said that it doesn't really matter like what your job title is, or if you come from a federal department, provincial department, an institution, a business. If you're there to talk about the health of the Bedore Lakes and works what is in the best interest of the fisheries, then we want to work with you. And because the Mi'kmaq communities had led this, they had naturally blended in this concept of Indigenous knowledge systems. And the term even Indigenous knowledge, like that's kind of a foreign concept in our communities. Like, it's not a terminology that Native communities came up with. It was other people that have come up with it to describe like a methodology or a way of knowing. So this is why we like to refer to it as a system, because it's a whole other knowledge paradigm, as opposed to like a Western science paradigm, which you have a specific methodology. And the best way to work with these systems is to work with them at the beginning and try to find ways to integrate them together rather than having parallel processes. I know that up in the north, up in Nunavut, Groups like Smart Ice, for example, are using this concept as well. The Inuit up there know where critical areas are. They're working with NGOs with territorial and federal governments to find out critical areas that are important to study to understand the impact of climate change, for example. So those are the kind of things that are really important, but a lot of the times, like, this integrative work is not really widely known or celebrated. Sometimes they might be written up, but if you go into communities and ask the communities about if they've partnered in different kinds of projects, especially in the marine sector, they will explain to you, like, who are people that they've worked with, and they probably can help describe, like, why that partnership is actually working. So there's no formula for this per se, but it does really start with, like, building those foundational relationships of trust and co-developing the research questions together.
Interesting. Now, Peter, we've talked about the term community-led quite a bit already today, and how does community-led projects or that type of approach, how does it change the dynamic from, like, the parachute science that we've talked about in before, where scientists are coming in, taking the information, leaving without sharing it? How does a community-led approach sort of flip that on its head and change it completely and change that dynamic?
So you let them drive the bus. The old way of parachuting in and out, or the take kind of scenario, is they never shared back. It wasn't a reciprocal relationship. It wasn't started together or understand each other's roles. It was just one dictating to the other. So when you have community-led, we know at ONC that we're on the right track or not. They'll let us know what is working, what is not. Thankfully, we're usually in the positive of that, because we already, we've established the foundation of that project in that relationship, and we're there to listen. So if they particularly say community-led, they have we got some sensors in the water, say with the Gitgat Nation, we got a community observatory in the water, but they let us know that they would like a hydrophone turned off, that's not, instead of to not have as public access, or they would like their shore camera turned off because it's over the harbor, that kind of thing. We have our data agreements are built on fair care principles and the understanding of OCAP, so that can be always adapted at any time, and they can always let us know if they need something changed in it. Of course, we're into having our data public, but they can always turn something on and turn something off. So that's an example of community-led. And then just another example of some of the successes, we did a tsunami risk assessment project on our northwest coast, as all the knowledge holders shared all the history of tsunamis as far back as 1700. We got that all into research. We shared that research back, and actually we ended up getting some extra funding for that tsunami risk assessment project to do a documentary. That was a way of giving back as well, back to all the communities, screened to all the communities, shared with them, and so they have their elders in that on video in that documentary, as well as all the transcripts. But what we also, when the community let us know how tsunami interacted, in 1700, through their legends and their history and their stories, which communities were wiped out, we got to understand the boots on the ground scenario, which really complemented our data and which allowed for us to understand that our data was on track from what the community and the history was telling us, and then up to as early as 1964 or the last Chilean surge that hit our coast. So that knowledge that was shared, that project would have been flat if it didn't have actually the rich, colorful knowledge in the stories. We would just be going off our data, and we won't actually have prime examples of stories that, oh, this wave actually turned here, that's how it interacted with this community, it bypassed this community. The stories that they told us that it actually did that are actually correct and stuff. But they let us know. They let us know their stories, and and how much capacity they have. Our indigenous communities are overly engaged right now. It takes time. They have full-time jobs and everything too.
Yeah.
But that project was an example of indigenous knowledge systems working with Western science per se, where we were flying over with LiDAR, crunching data and the numbers, but it allowed us to know that we were on track.
Amazing. Now, this community-led initiative or sort of term really triggered a conversation that we had previously, where you described when different nations are, in your experience, are have an opportunity to work with somebody, or whether it be outside a nation or within a nation, there's like a three kind of things that they look out for, for their own, like how it's going to benefit sort of the area, like the nation. Can you just talk a little bit about, what each, like what nations kind of think about when an opportunity is presented, or say like they start talking about an ONC partnership or anything else? There's something that they really, I'd love for you to speak to something on how they kind of look at it and how it's going to benefit the nation.
Okay, so I'm going to try to remember the three things that we talked about previously. I think we were talking about the concept of people, place, and profits.
That's it. Yeah, that's it. That's
Right.
it. Yeah.
And this is actually, this is something that comes up when you talk about in the business world. So in the business world, they also will talk about economic profits, economic sustainability. They'll talk about environmental sustainability and social sustainability, and those are the three legs to the concept of sustainable development, which came out of the Rio Summit back in 1991. But when we talk about people, place, and profits, the reason why that's important is that if you're working specifically with an industry group or a business, they naturally have to look at profitability. That's really their bottom line, and they talk about value to shareholders. But when you work with indigenous communities, and I've worked with like many of them, some of them are sort of economically minded, some of them are environmentally minded, and the rest are kind of in between. They will talk about people, places, and profits in that order. The first thing that they will, no matter who you talk to in the communities, they will talk about what is the benefit to community members if we engage in this project. The second thing that they'll talk about is what's the benefit to the long-term sustainability, because people will hear about the 7-generational thinking that many First Nations in Canada use. Not all of them, but many of them do. But they're thinking intergenerationally, like how will this impact the generations yet to come? Because the ancestors did all of the work so that we today could benefit from having a healthy environment, healthy fisheries, healthy natural resources. And in the future, we will be the ancestors. And we want to make sure that our descendants understand that we're working within the powers that we have to try to work towards a positive outcome for the generations yet to come. And then finally, they will talk about profits. Like Native people in general are not opposed to industry or not opposed to profit, because we understand we live in an economy that has to have monetary value.
Right.
But oftentimes they will forego the maximizing economic benefits if they feel there's going to be environmental harm. And like a simple example for this, like I have a friend who was in charge of the community fisheries, and they ran their lobster boats. And they knew that they could put 2 people on the lobster boats and make a profit for the band and make a profit for the individuals. But they purposely would put 3 people on the lobster boats to increase employment for individuals. So you're employing 3 people per boat rather than 2.
Yep.
Now, that's an economic hit, but it's a longer term benefit for community members to elevate all levels, all standards of living. So people, place, and profits, and usually in that order.
Yeah, love that. Thank you so much for that, because that's something that stuck with me for quite some time since we had that conversation, and I love that. Thank you so much. Now, Maya, can you talk us through what I know every project's unique, and working with every nation is unique, but can you kind of take us through what it looks like to partner with or how it's looked like in the past to partner with where ONC partners with an Indigenous community from like initial conversation to like deployment of an instrumentation? Can you just kind of take us through what would typically happen?
Sure. You're right with what you led off with, though, that
It's very
each
unique.
situation, project, community, each person that you're talking to is different. But I will try to answer your question with what we often do, let's say. So we've already talked about how important a relationship is. And you were asking before, is it better if a community comes to us or we come to a community? And I mean, I would say both happen and both are fine. Sometimes communities are happy to see somebody show up and say, we have this funding for this project, and if it already aligns with something they're doing, they might welcome somebody who's coming in and saying, we can do this with you. But it is always great for us when a community comes to us and says, we have this need. For example, we're very interested in building up our program in acoustic monitoring. So this is something that we've heard. And we're concerned, for example, about increasing vessel traffic, and we want to be able to understand how that might be affecting marine mammals and other wildlife in our territory. So, that would be something that has actually happened. So based on those initial conversations, we would look at, well, where does Ocean Networks Canada have the ability to suggest maybe a monitoring system? How can we suggest collecting data to help advance this community's interest? And the type of support that we offer, because we are a scientific facility, so part of what we do, depending what they're coming to us with, might be making recommendations or giving advice. It might be helping to procure equipment and install it. And then the follow-on too is, let's say that we do decide together that we wanted to have some kind of installation, for example, of one of our coastal community observatory systems. We would try to secure funding for that, and once we would have the funding, then we would go through the whole process of permitting, which also I will add that that's a formal process where we have to engage with Indigenous communities too, because there is a point in the process where input is sought from communities. So if the groundwork hasn't been correctly laid and you're going to try to go through a permit process for an installation, you won't be advancing with that.
Right.
So for ONC, we for sure do all of that work in the beginning to ensure that when we come to ask permission to start a project, we already know that the nations whose territory it would be operating in are supportive and hopefully more than supportive, hopefully also invested in the project and partners in the project and co-designing with us. That's the ideal. So anyway, then if we've gone through all of that, we have our permits in place and we actually start the monitoring program or install the equipment. Then the work starts to collect the data. So Ocean Networks Canada, using our both people power and our data management system, this is one of the core things we do, is collect, manage, and provide access to ocean data. And we also have our data teams who do both automated and manual quality control of the data, and we have systems that produce data products, so data presented in different ways that can be downloaded. And then I think something also that's a real strength of ONC that we've built over these many years is we have people whose role it is then to work with the communities to ensure that they can access the data and also to help in interpreting the data, and if there are ways that we can process the data that makes it more easily usable for them, that's something else we can do. So the kind of follow on, once the equipment's in the water and collecting data, then to say, how can this be used? And within my department too, we have teams that work with youth. So we have our K-12 education team, and we have the Indigenous Community Learning Coordinator, and we have a post-secondary education team. So we also work with teachers and students in formal and informal learning settings to try and, as much as we can, ensure that meaningful use can be made of all the data and information that's being collected.
Right. Awesome. Yeah, it's such an integral, like such a it's not an easy process, but it works well. And like we mentioned before, every system, every conversation, every person, every nation, it's all different, it's all unique, and so there's adaptability, which I think is very interesting. Now, Peter, not everything happens smoothly. It's there's a lot of as you mentioned before, mistrust that happens, from past experiences and so forth, that happens. We talked about trust as being, one of the main challenges to overcome and to build, so that a proper relationship can be built and then work can be done, if it's deemed appropriate to do that after. What other main challenges, what are the main challenges to increasing this Indigenous participation in ocean monitoring and research? And then if there are challenges, like other challenges, how can they be addressed?
I haven't come across too many challenges at ONC, just because we start that conversation early. That's what I encourage other ocean scientists to do is, where they run into problems is that communication is not started early and they think they could just fly into a community and start digging around. That's where you'll end up in big trouble. And and what they perceive as consultation is normally not. And it takes time. It could take up to a year to properly engage with a community. And the healthy ones are the ones that write the proposal together. So they know those expectations. I was approached by this Dutch scientist, and he said, my colleagues, and I'm starting to warm up, and I've been hearing you, and my colleagues really don't want to work with Indigenous. What do I say to them? And I just say, it's simple. You like long-term data? You want to be invited back? Well, you got to start on the right foot. Otherwise, your data is going to be incomplete. And sometimes you got to put it in numbers for people to understand, unfortunately. But it really comes down to mutual respect for one another as human beings. It's really that simple. The way people talk about sometimes Indigenous is like we're not even human, and a lot of the cases I have to deal with is like how to deal with an Indian. And it gets tiring after a while, but it keeps me busy, and it keeps Ken and I advocating around the world for Indigenous and realizing, there's still a lot of work to be done. But, we've seen some change. We've seen some movement. We see more conferences echoing a lot of the work that Ken and ONC has done. They're starting to lead their own initiatives and be very respectful, have more space for Indigenous. A lot of times space is taken up by Indigenous experts, as opposed to actually having the Indigenous present themselves. In Canada, we've had a very healthy guardianship. As far back 1,000 years, we had guardian watchmen, and from east and west, it varies in how that guardianship works. But we've been managing our own fisheries. We've been sustaining, for so long and have so much experience sustaining. But really, it's just amazing. Like there's, Indigenous like to do are into business, or they actually have biologists. Like, oh wow, like it's still that still comes up worldwide, But in Canada, we got a long way to go, but we still are leading Indigenous engagement. We're trying to get to that point where we're not leading anymore, and the world is on point when it comes to working with Indigenous around the world. But sometimes it's as simple as tell me a story, tell me who you are, before you do anything. But and there's sometimes government policies that make it hard for scientists to work with Indigenous, and that's got to change. There's funding apparatuses that are out of date, and they have deadlines that don't work well with nations. That needs to change. Because a lot of those funding apparatuses kind of makes one party dictating to another, and that doesn't work for our people. So that's slowly changing, and we're encouraging for more change in that. But I've definitely seen a lot of growth in Indigenous partnerships,
Yeah.
and yeah, hopefully it continues.
Good. Yeah. No. Absolutely. Now, Ken, sometimes there's a lot. Well, we talked about there's misconceptions. As Peter just mentions that people have about Indigenous peoples and technology or science. How do you respond to some when you hear those misconceptions, either told directly to you, or people don't want to work with you or other nations? How do you respond to that? Like, I know for me, emotionally, if I were that would make me pretty angry. But like, how do you respond to it in a way where either if you decide to continue to have that relationship, you want to benefit from it, or do you just break off that relationship? How do you respond to that type of these types of misconceptions?
Well, it kind of depends because there are segments of our society that no matter what you tell them, they've already kind of set in their ways, right? There are other segments of our society that they may not know how to work with Indigenous communities, but they are trying to figure out how to do it. And then some people in the middle that could be, I guess, could be educated, like they're open to learning. And so, first of all, I kind of assess like where people are at. Like if they want to learn, yeah, I'm very happy to share with them. But if they're just trying to formulate counter arguments, like to me that's not a healthy use of my time and my energy. I try to look for the people that are open to doing this kind of work with our communities. That's my personal aspect. And I only really feed enough information that they can understand. Like we can't really always talk about the entire history of what's been going on. Like why are Native people put on reserves, tiny little reserves, right? And this has come like there's still an active Indian Act in Canada, right? So we are a systemically racist country here in Canada because of that. We're the only group that has a people that is being governed by a federal department, and putting us on reserves was a way of pulling us away from resources so that others could exploit. There's also still an epidemic against murdered and missing Indigenous women. So Indigenous women are still being exploited. Sometimes they're being abused, and sometimes they go missing. They go murdered. We have overpopulations within our prison systems, and that's not to say that Native people are like bad or criminals. It's just that the systems are stacked against us. We had laws preventing us from practicing our cultures. We had laws against us having fair representation in courts. But despite all of these different things, the strength of our communities really comes back to the culture and the family units within the communities themselves. We still have governing nations. We still have that long-term vision. We honor our elders. We honor those kind of visions, and we try to take those visions from the elders and try to make them usable and workable in today's environment. We're not peoples that live in the past. We have been adapting. We are going to continue to adapt. We do need help with access to capital. Any work in the ocean sector costs money. And there is a large disparity between what Indigenous community has funding to do as opposed to what needs to be done. So one of the strong things, and this is some of the work that we've done with Ocean Networks Canada when we did this work for the Ocean Decade, the UN Decade for Ocean Sciences, is trying to advocate and try to figure out other funding mechanisms that are outside the federal system. Because if you have multiple funding systems and multiple funding partners, you have an opportunity to actually bring your community priorities forward. And if Indigenous communities are empowered to do the work that they know needs to be done, we will have a better chance at fighting climate change, fighting the shortages of fisheries, fighting soil erosion, and really having respect for the relationship we have with the ocean and with nature.
Amazing.
Yeah, and
Peter,
just wanted to add
sorry,
to
go ahead.
that. Yeah, so like when I said we're on the front lines, we know the changes in the species. We know the fluctuations, the threads that are happening. So when we talk about big tech too, it's like supporting indigenous nations. Is that why not give them the tech? And then that also helps save costs for scientists. That works for their own data, their own initiatives. to inform their own leaders properly on what's happening in the ocean. A lot of times we're interested in the same type of data, same type of science, but building that like relationship where there could be a sharing of tech. And so for example, ONC many moons ago we had done a polar study with sea ice melt with the Inuit, and the Inuit knowledgers would let us know what's happening, the fluctuations in the sea ice. We put monitors into the sea ice. They would go gather it up. They would let us know what was happening. But that's like a partnership. That's a great example of how there's there's a study there that we both have concerns about, and that we agree on. But given the people who are right on the front lines, the tech is something that works for all of us and works for climate change.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. Final question here, and I'll start with Peter. What does a strong, respectful, thriving relationship between ONC and Indigenous nations look like 10 years from now?
Well, if we start on the right foot, a lot of those studies can continue.
Right.
Often there are studies out there, maybe not always ONC related, but that continue to gain the funding because they started that 5-year proposal. Then they got another 5 years per se, and going to 10 years. So that's a really healthy relationship. That's a healthy partnership. Both sides are working well together, but that's because they started from the ground up, as opposed to it coming abstractly in. And we have observatories at ONC that are long term, and different studies are based on those observatories. As Maya mentioned, it could be tracking shipping, which is a concern for the GitGat, as they're going to have more shipping for the liquid natural gas facility that's going in Kitimat. So they're worried about their humpback whales in the Douglas Channel, also noise pollution, and also wake impacts on their shorelines, and how is that going to affect their clam beds, for instance. Or we've got the Tsleil-Waututh studying the pollution in the Burrard Inlet. They are hoping to bring some clam beds back in the Burrard Inlet and Vancouver. So these are some of those examples.
Yeah. And Ken, how about yourself? How do you envision what it looks like 10 years from now?
I think that, there's a trend where our younger people are understanding like what's happening in the modern world, and they're not afraid of technology, but they're also like able to bring their sort of cultural self into these working environments, where if you go back like 20, 25 years, that really wasn't the norm. It was, you had to leave your culture and your identity behind if you wanted to fit in a modern world. I think like with the work that ONC is doing and this community-based approach, that you're going to see many more Indigenous peoples working in these ocean tech kind of world, and helping to shape the technology, shape the kind of work that needs to be done. They will have true partnerships with more Western science types, and I think like those kind of partnerships is what's really needed, because we only have one planet, right? Yeah. And if we're going into a program or into a project just to build ourselves up, like that's ego. We really have to look at what's in the best interest of the marine space, the ocean space, for the betterment of the planet, so that we will all benefit. That's what I'm hoping is going to happen, is that we're going to have many more young people that are going to be taking up these positions that people like myself and Peter are occupying now.
Absolutely. Well said. And Maya, what do you think, from a perspective of, you started this program 10 years from now, or you helped start this program 10 years from now, like, where do you envision this type of relationship?
A lot of the problems that we're working on now are very challenging, and people have a lot of anxiety around climate change and what's happening in our oceans, and we know it's critical to take action now. So my hope 10 years from now is that we've really found a way to work together where we're bringing the best of both knowledge systems, so science and ocean knowledge systems, and we're using them for the betterment of these communities and of our planet and our ocean as a whole. I think we have to realize that this is a time for working together. And I fully agree too with what Ken is saying about young people and youth. If we think about 10 years from now, like my hope would be that Ocean Networks Canada has found a way to share the resources that we have, being a university affiliated national research facility, with communities, and that we have young people who've decided to pursue ocean science and are also bringing their cultural heritage and their knowledge as Indigenous youth to this work. And so, and in 10 years, they're going to be the ocean professionals, and they're going to be the leaders, and they're going to be leaders in their community. So, for ONC, I mean, I hope that we do have long-term relationships with communities. The kind of questions around climate change, you need a lot of data to measure what's happening now and to understand change. And then you need a lot of people working together to understand what solutions are really going to have an impact in communities and for the world. So, that would be my dream, that we're working together on all of that.
Absolutely. I think this was such a great conversation to have. I'm sure we can talk about this for hours and hours on end, but we have to end it here. But I'd love to invite you all back on to talk more about this and get into some of the specifics of these projects. But I've learned a lot in terms about building relationships between looking at Western science, looking at Indigenous communities and how everybody can benefit. And I think it's really important to have these types of conversations. So I want to thank you all for coming on the podcast and teaching us everything that you've experienced and you've known, and we really appreciate you being on the podcast. And I know my audience is gonna love this type of conversation. So thank you so much for all of you for being on.
We're just getting
Thanks for
started.
having us.
Yes, William.
Absolutely, just getting started. I like that. Thank you so much. We'll talk to you soon. Thank you, Maya, Peter, and Ken for joining us on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. This was one of those, I feel like, life-changing type of interviews where I learn more than I normally learn. A lot of times I'll have scientists on the podcast. I'll have, data technologists, conservationists, and so forth. And we talk a lot about building relationships with local communities, and we'll talk a lot about science and the technical aspects. But the building relationships, we very rarely go into detail about how those relationships are built and how long it takes and the patience that are required by both parties to build those relationships. As Peter said, sometimes these relationships might not take just a couple of weeks. It might actually take years to build. It might actually take that time, months, years, however, a decade, to build a trust where both parties can not only add value, but also gain value from the relationship. And this is a very important aspect to marine conservation that we don't talk about enough, especially the nuances about what it's like to build those relationships. Some of these relationships can be complex. Some of these relationships can take time. But once you build those relationships, just as Peter and Ken and Maya outlined during this interview, this is something that could be fruitful for everybody and allow us to learn more about the ocean, more about our coast, more about the communities who use the ocean, live around the ocean, and benefit from the ocean, but also suffer consequences from the ocean, and being able to help everybody in hand and understand how the ocean is shaping Canada, not only from an environmental perspective, but also from a cultural perspective. And I think that's really, really important. So I want to thank Maya, Ken, and Peter for joining us today on this ongoing series of Surfacing Secrets, Explore the Ocean, Know the Planet. This is something that's very special to me, and I'm really happy that ONC has been able to partner with us on this and support us through this series. It's been a lot of fun. We're going to continue to do this every month, so stay tuned. You can follow, subscribe, but also go to oceannetworks.ca to find out more about Ocean Networks Canada and what they do and how they serve communities. It's a lot of fun. The website's amazing. There's a data portal for all my scientist friends out there who want access to data. Like I said, it's a lot of fun to explore for anybody of any age, from any background, and get to know the coast of Canada, the deep of Canada a little bit more, and all their programs with Indigenous communities. It's a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to these relationships building and to finding out more about that. So thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.